We are very lucky to have tonight Abby Sallenger, who's with us from the USGS and the U.S. Geological Survey in St. Petersburg, Florida. Abby received his BA in Geology and PhD in Marine Science from the University of Virginia. And for a while was the chief scientist at the Geological Survey Center for Coastal Geology, but it's probably in a more exciting role now, not having to be the chief of a bunch of people, but actually do what he does now is lead this USGS Storm Impact Research Group, looking at how the coast changes during extreme storms, like we've all seen recently in Katrina. Some really important things. I think in 2007, Abby received the USGS Shoemaker Award for Lifetime Achievement in Communication, which is quite important, as I think a lot of us agree. And also in 2009, received a special award in oceanography from the National Hurricane Conference. And then the last of the accolades of the many that I'll point out, which I think are really interesting and hopefully folks can engage with Abby about, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is named Abby the lead author of the Coastal Systems and Low-Lying Areas chapter of the next Global Assessment report. So an important role in that, one that we can all identify with, those of us who are permanent residents here in low-lying coastal areas. But tonight, Abby's going to talk with us a bit about his very successful book, Island in the Storm, and some of the other projects he's been working on. And he's the second, as I said, in our distinguished lecture series. After the lecture, we'll have a break, and then he'll meet the conservation biology and policy class later on this evening. But we'll be around tomorrow, I imagine, for a little bit. I just wanted to try and catch it at other times. But Abby, thanks for coming.
Great. Thanks very much, Doug. What I want to talk about tonight is a book I spent several years on, but I did it for a particular reason. It's about a great storm that came ashore in Louisiana in the mid-19th century. You know, we've had a lot of storms. I mean, we've had storms over the past decade that are worth many books describing what happened in the the science of it, what happened and why it happened and stuff like this. But this particular storm I found unique, and I hope to convince you of that as we go through. Not just another storm that has occurred about 150 years ago. And one aspect of it that I found fascinating, terrifying actually, is, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but I consider my home as Kitty Hawk, north of you guys. My father was in the military, he was a Navy pilot, and we moved everywhere. But we came home every summer to that place. What I want to talk about is a storm that put a barrier island completely underwater. You may think this might happen a lot. It really doesn't. Okay, we have storms commonly where waves overtop an island and kind of lap across the top, carrying sand from the front part of the island to the back part of the island, and the whole thing migrates landward. Along the eastern seaboard of the United States, professors at Duke, actually, over the last 30, 40 years, and elsewhere have come up with the classic understanding of barrier islands and how they move and do something like that. But they can also, what's becoming very clear, and I think it's mostly the improved detection methods and stuff like that we have today, that it's not just waves rolling over the top of an island. We can actually turn an island into a shoal, into a sandbar for hours. And whoever lives there obviously has to deal with it. My book, Eyelid in the Storm, I'm a scientist, a research scientist who writes papers in my day job, like a lot of you guys do. But the book, I wanted to include science in kind of a non-textbooky kind of way to get the points across through the people's eyes who are on that island. And it turns out for this storm, one of the things I find particularly unique about the storm is the survivors, a number of the survivors had extremely long, detailed accounts of what happened, and they did that for different reasons. And they talked about what it was like when they were living beautiful homes they built along this island that we'll talk about. 2 stories high, only propped up from the sand about 3 feet, a meter or so. And when the island went completely underwater with waves sweeping across the top, what happened to them? And they all tell it from a different perspective, which I find very, very interesting. And the emotional aspects of that, the scientific aspects of that, the book gets into. The island, let me see, how do we do here? There we go. The island that I'll be talking about is called the Eyelid, or Last Island in French. Okay, here's the Mississippi River. This is the Mississippi Delta, and this is the bird's foot, as they call it, coming out from the delta. But this is the last barrier island. There's a whole chain of barrier islands that go along here, but this is the last one as you go to the west. Okay, in the 1850s, it turns out that this won't surprise you, that living in New Orleans and places like Baton Rouge and Lafayette was extremely odorous during the summertime. Extraordinarily hot, muggy, obviously no air conditioning. And it wasn't only uncomfortable, it was downright dangerous. Yellow fever ran rampant during these times. In New Orleans, 3 years before this storm, 10,000 or 8,000 or 9,000 people died of yellow fever during the summer, early 1850s. It was a gruesome, I go into what the symptoms were, but we don't need to go through that today, but it's in the book, and it's a very, extremely gruesome thing. They had no idea that it was mosquitoes that were carrying the disease around. But they looked for safer places to be during the summer. And one of the places they chose was Eyelid. And they built a resort, essentially, there. And these were the rich planters, the wealthy shopkeepers from New Orleans. They'd close up during the winter, during the summer, and they'd head out. A fascinating mixture of cultures. We have French, we have German. This was still, slavery was active in the United States at the time, so they brought slaves with them. So this was a very fascinating time and an interesting mixture of the people who came out there. Equally as interesting as the people, though, I think, is the land. I have a geologic background. And one thing that I found fascinating about this area is the land is moving. It's changing. And it's doing it constantly. Okay, on the beach over here, it's coming in and out and stuff like this. Well, this is going down as well. It's sinking. It's subsiding. It's subsiding about 1 centimeter per year. And that induces a sea level rise relative to the land that actually exacerbates the kinds of problems that occur during an extreme storm. It is the kind of thing that we'll be talking about with the class tomorrow, particularly, about how sea level rise can make hurricanes worse. Sea level rise is a very slow, almost sluggish kind of process. Hurricanes happen very quickly. But they can interact in ways that can be really really difficult to deal with. Okay, this is the cover of the book. It was drawn in 1861. At that time, the Union Army actually commissioned artists around the country. Actually, one particular guy, where's Bachman, to go to Charleston, to go to Savannah, and draw these wonderful bird's eye views of the harbors there and stuff like that. And that's what we have here. The publisher gave the original drawing to in New York, to an artist in New York who brought in the clouds and the forbidding colors and stuff like that. But they really did an interesting job. Here's what the Eyelid looks like close up. 1853. This was about the time when there were excellent maps by the Coastal Geodetic Survey, or the Coast Survey they called it at the time. The first time, 1840s, 1850s. Here we have about a 30-kilometer long Eyelid. It was several kilometers wide in places. Marsh on the landward side from a sandy beach. And this sandy beach only rose up about 2 meters high or so. And that was it. And I first came here, I was brought here by a colleague at LSU back in the 1980s. And what happened was they brought me out there, and I'd never seen an island like this before in my life. This place was no higher than this podium right here. It's extraordinarily low. I'm used to Kitty Hawk or Southern Shores, if you know the area, and our house there was up 60 feet high on a dude, a very tall, prominent dude, a different world. And these were the barrier islands of Louisiana. So it was extremely difficult. Extremely interesting to look at. If we look in here closer to the west end of it, you could see a little opening from the side. The steamboats would come in back here, and they would pull into this harbor back here. Along the island out here, there were houses, maybe 50, 60, 2, 3-story houses along the beach. They got to them with wagons and horses and stuff like this running along the beachfront. It was a thriving community with a hotel. This was the period of steam, and we had flat-bottomed steamboats coming in here quite a bit. Offshore, we had larger steamboats, ocean-going steamboats that ran between New Orleans and Galveston. They also got tied up in the middle of the storm. Here we look at what's called Village Harbor. And these are actually the houses you can see on the 1853 map. You just see some indication, an indication of where the hotel is. Steamboats would pull back here and come in here. What the people didn't realize, very well anyway, is that they had signs right there on the beach of what could happen, of what would happen, or was going to happen. And that's where very, very large logs and trees laid along the beach line, up at the crest of the beach. And again, the crest was only about as high as the podium here. And they didn't think much of it. Actually, they talked about it in their, accounts of the storm as a wonderful supply of firewood. Yeah, that was it. But the waves had a way to get those up there. Something had happened here before. And that was one thing that they were really worried about. Another thing here is they had no way of knowing that a storm was coming. The storm came from the Gulf of Mexico across Cuba and directly towards the island. Is they had no warning at all for the storm, other than the subtle things that you saw, like the trees on the island and stuff like that. What you didn't see, or what had started right about this time, which was fascinating. You know, the castle, the building they call the castle at the Smithsonian. At that time, that was the only building, or there was maybe just one other in the Smithsonian. And they had hung a map of the United States. And every morning, this was a first weather map. Every morning they would get, what do you call it, teletype. And they would get, okay, there's a front moving through Chicago, and you know, they would track it coming across the country. That's the only way they had to really look at weather. Of course, it told them nothing about what was coming in from offshore. This was a time when, you know, those ships offshore, which give us, you know, wonderful satellites, of course, but the ships also give us wonderful detail about what's happening on the oceans and stuff. There was no radio communication. There was no teletype between the ships at that time and on land, and so they had no idea this thing was coming, and it caught them totally unawares. This is a picture in what they call Frank Leslie's Illustrated. Very popular Time magazine kind of thing. Life magazine, if you guys, for those here remembering that. With beautiful pictures of what is happening around the world. But they're all drawn. And I found this amazing. This is a picture of what happened, or what the situation looked like over the Ile de Neer at the height of the storm. This was published 21 days after the storm. I found that amazing. You know, they would get on the teletype with, or receive information from survivors about what happened, and then artists in New York and stuff would draw this. But that's basically what it looked like. People completely inundated and swept offshore. I'm going to talk about two people real quick, just to give you a feel, not only for some of the physical things that were happening to the island, but also what was happening to these people. And one of the people was a young woman named Emma Meal, French Creole. Father was born in France. Her mother was Creole in Louisiana. And she was there with her parents, 7 siblings. They all died, except for her. And it was kind of curious. Over and over again in their remarks about the storm, they talked about the wind coming from the land. You know, they knew at the time the wind coming from the ocean was a problem. I mean, it could be a big problem quickly. But the wind coming from the land didn't seem to bother them too much. Although there were, you know, if you dig into the literature, the scientific literature at the time, they talk about rotaries, and that's what they called hurricanes. And they kept saying the left hand, you have to worry about the left-hand side of a rotary, which is bringing the wind offshore. And that's exactly what was happening here, but they had no clue. They thought it was, don't worry, it's just kind of a pain. You know, it was flooding from the landward side of the island. It almost moved the water from the land across the island into the ocean. And that really got them going. As a matter of fact, this Emma Meal and her family had a 3-story home. There, she was, and the home was knocked out. and she was picked up and driven offshore, not onshore. And she had the presence of mind, she was 16 years old, and to hang on to lumber and stuff like that. And she was driven far offshore. And you have to understand physically what that meant at the time. The winds were horrific offshore, coming onshore, farther onshore. So it was sending very large waves in. And waves have this peculiar way that they break offshore and then they roll in, obviously. But their height after breaking is a function of the water depth, essentially. So it's about 1 to 1. So when she was in about 2 feet of water, there were 2-foot breakers on top of her. But she was driven way offshore, estimated kilometers, tens of kilometers perhaps. And so she went through 5-foot water depths with 5-foot waves, 10-foot waves, 15-foot, you just play it on out. And yet she had the presence of mind to hang on to this bunch of lumber or whatever it was, trash that came from the house. And she survived out there for 8 to 9 hours, getting beat up, all this kind of stuff. And then this rotary they talk about switched her out. And remarkably, if they showed this in a movie or something, you go, come on. But it blew her right back to the same island within a kilometer of where her house went down. And one of her father's slaves actually found her on the beach and picked her up. And there was a doctor there. At this point, my wife tells me, Abby, stop talking because it's a great story. That she ends up getting married and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, she loses her entire family. It's a wonderful story. But my wife says, don't give it away. This was, Another guy. This is the story that I get asked more about than any other story in the book. I get letters about this. Some of them not so nice, because one thing about Louisiana is everybody's kind of related to everybody, and in a way. And there are a lot of ancestors of those, or descendants of people who were on that island. And there was a gentleman, Michael Slaughter, he was a German, married to a German wife. And they had 7 siblings. And he was the only one who survived. And let me read you in his words. This has been a traumatic thing and an interesting thing. A group of my friends, we were talking about this at dinner, went off. It's been a while. This was one of the things we discussed over a bottle of wine or two. It was kind of interesting. But let me read you his words about what happened. And at this point, Emile had already been swept offshore and then returned to the beach. Michael Slaughter expected to die. He was in the next home down from Emile. His home didn't go down with the offshore winds. It survived the first onslaught. It went down the second time when the wind and waves came from offshore. He lay on a mattress on the floor of his home. There was no roof over him. There were no walls around him. He could not move his right side. With the wind now coming from the sea, he asked his wife if the Gulf was washing across the island. She answered that it was beginning to cover the sand. An intact roof floated by. It knocked her to the ground. It was the last Michael saw of her. The Gulf then went after the rest of his family. The water floated the wooden floor with everyone sitting or lying on it. It propelled it toward the bay. Then the huge raft lodged behind a cistern. The waters now maddened, this is his quote, the waters now maddened by resistance came rushing over the floor, wrote Slaughter. Everyone and everything was swept into the Gulf of Mexico. Slaughter's little girl screamed. She was a little more than a toddler. It leapt onto her father, wrapping her arms tight around his neck. Together they flailed in the soup of waves and foam and wreckage. I now rolled over and over, recalled Slaughter, drinking in the hated fluid by great mouthfuls. The dear child still fastened to me. When I thought, for reader, I could still think that I must be near gone. Slaughter justified what happened next on his dire circumstances. He expressed sorrow for the consequences of his action, but accepted no responsibility for it and admitted no shame. I put my hands to those of my child and broke her hold of me. God only knows what became of the dear one. Being relieved, I now rose to the surface. You know, if you take any of us and you put us into a situation, you know, a horrible situation, just instantaneously like that, you know, how would you respond? This man was, as you can see developed through the book, was a very strong, a leader of the community, large man for the time. You know, I'm 6'5", he's 6 foot, but 6 foot tall, and 1850 was like, you know, probably 6'9" today or something. But it's amazing. And again, he was the only one to survive the storm. So it's been really interesting to see what that meant, to discuss it with the people. Let me tell you now from the land's point of view what happened. That was from the people's. The island went completely underwater. There was a gradient, if you will. Oceanographers will talk about a gradient of sea level, water deeper offshore, sloping over the island, and so it basically just runs down slope. And so the water's running like a son of a gun across the island during the height of the storm when the wind is blowing on shore. It's taking sand with it. The island is changed forever. Again, this is what it looked like prior to the storm. During the storm, it lost a tremendous amount of surface area. We'll never know how much. Okay, but we know later how much, what's happened. It's almost like we took this island and we pushed it over the edge. And this happens in Louisiana for reasons that have to do with sea level rise, that have to do with things like diminishing sand supply to the beaches, things like being hit again and again by Katrina and Rita and storms like this, which was unnamed back then. But this is what the place looked like in 1878, the exact same island. It had lost 78% of its surface area. Its front or Gulf of Mexico shore had retreated 2/3 of a mile, so eroded back 2/3 of a mile. It was phenomenal what happened. And what we've done over, since we worked there, and our colleagues at a number of universities in Louisiana, have tracked this and other barrier islands in terms of how long we expect it to survive if it continues to go downhill like this. And it should be gone by now. And the only reason, this was 1978, that it's still there, is because man has come in with tremendous here. I mean, this thing is 30 kilometers long. Okay, they rebuilt it. They rebuilt it kilometers wide in places. They filled in all of those inlets through the water. It's stuff like that. And so that's why the island's there, or it would have disappeared. We could talk about this if you wish, but There's no reason that this would be unique to Louisiana, to the Delta, this kind of response. If you could match the conditions for big hits with hurricanes, diminishing sand supply, and a very rapid sea level rise, you could get the same kind of response almost anywhere, including up the eastern seaboard. And that's what we're looking at right now. One thing that I find very interesting about what happened there, the social response to the physical environment, if you will. The people had invested a lot of money and effort, and they loved going to the coast. They've been doing that for a very long time. They decided not to rebuild, which is almost unheard of today. You never have that happen. There are places, Dauphin Eyelid, Alabama, that's been wiped out. The west end of it's been wiped out 4 times since 1979 and rebuilt every single time. A lot at federal expense, too. But this was at their expense, and they decided not to do it. And what they decided not to do is kind of amazing. The weekend, again, this sounds like one of these other movie kind of things that if it wasn't well enough documented in independent sources that we could compare, I'm not sure I would have bought it. But the weekend of the storm, an investment group met in New Orleans to build this structure on Eyelid. And it would have been the largest beachfront hotel in America at the time. One of the largest wooden structures in the world. Here's what it looked like closer. Several stories high, many hundreds of rooms there, and they decided not to do it. I've caught some grief about this, but I find it interesting, very interesting, that in 1850, let me back up a bit. I'm not one, Orrin Pilkey's a very good friend of mine, and we talk about a lot of stuff, and we basically agree on most things. But I will, I see there are places along the coastline that are a heck of a lot, and Orrin would agree with this, that are a heck of a lot safer than other places. There are places that are extraordinarily low, that are hit over and over and over again, and rebuilt over and over and over again, that just make absolutely no sense. But we're not really proposing, you don't live on the coast, I love living on the coast, or close to the coast, as much as anybody, and we'll continue to do that. But I do think there are places where you shouldn't live. And in the 1850s, they picked this island, and they were right. You saw what happened to it in the years following this storm. The island just broke up. And that was natural. Okay? We blame the Corps of Engineers for a lot of stuff, but not what happened to that island, that specific island. And it's an interesting thing. Anyway, thank you very much.